Cleveland Browns have been known as a laughingstock in the NFL for pretty much the entirety of my life so far, as they just have had rough times winning, rough times having success. They've been a laughingstock to a lot of people, to any normal fan in the NFL. What they would tell you is that the Browns were the worst team in the NFL. That's the way it's been for years, and somehow, some way, the Browns made probably what people are underrating as perhaps one of the greatest comebacks to fame ever in the history of the NFL. This is now the most exciting team in the NFL somehow. They went from being a team that could barely win a game just a few short years ago to the most exciting team in the NFL. You don't see turnarounds like this. And I just wanted to go back. I wanted to go year by year, just how they were able to pull off this feat, how they were able to make this comeback, which quite frankly is one of the most shocking things that has ever been seen in the history of the game. You know, it all starts in 2015. The Browns' 2015 season would be the first season that started to lay the groundwork for their future comeback in the future. This was an interesting year for the Browns. This was Mike Pettin year 2. Johnny Manziel was he was the guy going into week 1. Ended terribly. Obviously, we all know what happened with the Johnny Manziel situation. Just didn't work out. It was an absolute disaster. He was barely on the roster past the second half of that season, and they would go 13-3 that year. Would be a really poor year. Mike Pettin would be fired after just 2 seasons. Obviously got rid of Johnny Manziel, and they kind of did a minor wipe on the roster at that point, as they had really kind of taken some people out. And then they decided to bring in Hugh Jackson, which around the league everybody thought this was a heck of a hire at the time. And that leads us right into the 2016 season, which really, if the only thing that you can really remember from this year, other than the Browns being really bad and near terrible, was the emergence of Terrell Pryor, the former Ohio State star quarterback. And they had moved Terrell Pryor. You know, it's actually one of the most forgotten seasons ever, but they had moved Terrell Pryor to wide receiver. He also played quarterback at some points when they needed. Pretty much he was their entire source of offense. He had a 1,000-yard season. They only won 1 game, but he was definitely like the only bright side of that entire year of the 2016 season. They would go 1-15. As I said, really rough year for them. And at this point, you could start to see, you know, things are going bad. But I think people had, I wouldn't say high expectations going into the next year, but, you know, the fan base had to think, you know, they got to be better than this next year. And then you go into that 2017 season. So first off, right off the bat, Terrell Pryor, the only bright side of the 2016 season, he was gone to the Redskins. They chose not to pay him. Probably, in the end of the day, probably a wise decision. He wouldn't really do anything with the future of his career. But this is obviously one of the worst years in pro football history, if not the worst year ever. 0-16. Them and the 2008 Detroit Lions, the only teams to ever accomplish that feat. Just really a rock bottom moment for Cleveland this year. Was just one of those moments as a franchise where you're like, how are they going to come back from this? I remember thinking, you know, for the Browns fan base, it was like, you know, it was really hopeless. It was really hopeless. The Browns were, that's really when, you know, they became the butt of all jokes. This was really a rough time. 0-16 is hard. It's hard to come back from. Some franchises never recover from that. It took just until now that the Detroit Lions are viable again. So it took a long time. And that 2017 season, obviously, you had DeShone Kizer. They had him out there quarterback for some reason. That kind of ruined his career. He never really got an opportunity anywhere else. He did start nearly every game that year, though, within their 0-16 season. But, you know, Hugh Jackson assured the Browns that he had a plan. And then they went into the first promising year right after that. And they go into 2018. You have the first pick. Who are they going to draft is the big conversation. They end up drafting Baker Mayfield number 1. They also pick up Nick Chubb in the second round. That will be big later. But Baker Mayfield comes in. They do Other stuff offensively, you bring in Jarvis Landry for, I think it was like a third round pick they traded for. So this was a big addition. You have Baker Mayfield now quarterback. Jarvis Landry would provide a huge spark that year and for years to come. And you kind of see the bright side. Obviously, though, they got off to kind of a rocky start. Hugh Jackson was fired after, I think, like 4 games within this season. They said, man, this just isn't cutting it at this point. They continued the season. Baker actually went on a run towards the end, and they were alive in the playoff race till the final week. This was a 7-8-1 team. That's a huge improvement from 0-16, where they were. Huge improvement. Nick Chubb would emerge as this back that nobody could tackle him. He was a factor at this point. So 2018 was really the start of, okay, a comeback is possible. And that was a huge, huge year for just the future of the Cleveland Browns. And then you're going into 2019. There's hype. One of the most overhyped teams probably maybe in NFL history. Maybe not in NFL history, but it is up there. And you're going in there. They get OBJ in this trade. All of a sudden, it's the best offense ever. That's what a lot of people are saying. It's going to be ridiculous at this point. High expectations. And you go out there. They went out there in 2019, and it was just a disaster. It was an absolute disaster at that point. And, not to mention, their defense was getting a lot better at this point. They had brought in Myles Garrett after that 0-16 year. I forgot to put that in there. That was a big addition that they made. This 2019 season, they go 6-10. OBJ is frustrated. It was just a really frustrating year for Cleveland. One of the big mistakes that they made within this year is they decided to hire quarterbacks coach Freddie Kitchens for some reason, who had never had head coaching experience before. For some reason, they brought him in, which, was kind of probably not the best idea for a young team, a coach that's never been there before. So they bring him in and they go 6-10. This was also the year where Myles Garrett had the famous helmet incident where he tried to hit Mason Rudolph in the face. Was suspended for the rest of the year. That was one of the few bright wins actually for Cleveland this year, but that would be rough. And then you go into the 2020 season, and this year they bring in an offensive guy, Kevin Stefanski, and they roll out with Baker, same squad. And, the expectations, they had dampered. They weren't as what they were before. I remember early on, OBJ gets hurt in a big win against Cincinnati that they had. And you're thinking, can this team compete? And they just go on a heck of a run towards the end of the year, and they go 11-5. Cleveland actually has a winning year at this point, which was crazy. I just remember at the time, it was a weird COVID year, but pandemonium. But they have to play Pittsburgh, a team who had started 10-0. They got to play them in the first round. How are they going to do against them? And somehow, some way, the Browns win that game against the Steelers in kind of a dominating fashion. Nick Chubb had fully emerged at this point. He's this insane back. They could have went toe-to-toe with anybody that year. They had the talent. Jarvis Landry was playing really well. And then they go into that game against the Chiefs. And, there's one key play in that game with the Donovan's Jones play where the ball kind of trickle out of bounds. If you're a Browns fan, you know this. I think if that doesn't happen, they probably win the game. But obviously, Chad Henne comes in, barely wins it. But they were about a play away from, beating the team that actually went to the Super Bowl. So they were right there. And then you go into the 2021 season, just a weird year where Baker Mayfield is supposed to be the guy. They start out pretty decent. I think they're 3-1 to start the season. And then Baker tears his labrum, tries to play through it, didn't sit well within the franchise for the rest of his career there. There was just a disconnect. You could see that, can they play with Baker? Is Baker the guy? And they end up going 8-9 this year, which, it's a respectable year. It's a far cry from the 0-16. But obviously you have that issue of quarterback. It's a really talented roster. And then they make the big bombshell trade to acquire Deshaun Watson. Huge news going into the 2022 season. They give like 3 first-round picks, Watson facing the allegations, and they go out there in 2022, and you could see the talent within this team. You could see the talent within this team all the way through, but you could tell they were missing a quarterback. And even when Deshaun comes in later, they go, I believe, 3-3. So you can just see it from a mile away. But there are issues on the defense at this point. But they go 7-10, which is, it's a viable record. It's not, what the strive or expectation is, but Stefanski gets them to 7-10, and you realize that, he's never had a season where he's won less than 7 games, which you say what you want about that. But you realize 2022, it's still somewhat of a solidable year, and you didn't have your quarterback. They were playing with Jacoby Brissett through the first 11 games. And then you go into this ridiculous, kind of magical 2023 year where we're not done with it yet at this point. But Deshaun Watson gets hurt. Nick Chubb gets hurt week 2. The defense just turns into one of the best defense in the NFL, and you could just see it. Stefanski all of a sudden is an offensive genius who's probably going to win his 2nd head coach of the year. Joe Flacco coming in, reviving this team. They've clinched the 5th seed already. Optimism going into the playoffs. Some people I did a poll, some people think they can win the Super Bowl. It's just, if you look at their past seasons from 2018 on, they become respectable, and now within 2023, this has become, in a way, kind of America's team. It's the most exciting team. There's Steelers fans that I know that are following the Browns' journey at this point. It's just a team to root for. They went from a laughingstock to a very viable team who is unbelievably entertaining, and it took time, but they flipped it from the laughingstock of the NFL to perhaps the most exciting team in the NFL.